The boy had not said a single word in 93 days. Not at school, where a teacher had begun sending home weekly notes that grew more carefully worded with each passing week. Not at the pediatrician's office, where a doctor had used phrases like trauma response and situational, and give it time with the particular gentleness of a person managing a situation they suspected was larger than they were letting on. Not in the apartment his mother had moved to 3 months earlier, in the middle of a night when Marcus had been told only that they were going somewhere safe, which had been true in the ways that mattered, and terrifying in all the ways that didn't. And not when Detective Sarah Chen's headlights swept across the window of a black Tesla doing 94 miles per hour on an empty stretch of highway at 2:17 in the morning. In the back seat of that car, Sarah had pulled the Tesla over 2 miles past the on-ramp in the flat orange light of a service road lamp, and she was already composing the citation in her head as she walked up to the driver's window. The particular efficiency of someone 8 months into a detective's badge who still ran traffic stops with the muscle memory of 3 years on patrol, because old habits don't abandon you simply because your jurisdiction has expanded. The window came down. The driver was a man in his early 30s, handsome in the calculated way of people who know they are, with the particular looseness of someone who had been drinking, but not enough to show it clearly. He handed over his license before she asked for it, which was itself a small piece of information. "Evening," he said, in the tone of someone who had decided the interaction was already under control. "Evening." Sarah took the license. Danny Reyes, 31, an address in the city's west side. "Do you know how fast you were going?" "I was in a hurry." "Most people speeding at 2 in the morning are." "Where are you headed tonight?" "Visiting family." Sarah looked at the license. Then she looked, because she always looked, at the back seat. The boy was small, 6, maybe 7, in Spider-Man pajamas and no shoes, sitting perfectly upright in the center of the back seat, with no car seat and no seatbelt, his hands folded in his lap, with the specific stillness of a child who has learned that very still is the safest thing to be. He was looking at her. Not the way children usually look at police officers, with curiosity, or with the wide-eyed alarm of someone who has been told both to trust and to fear a uniform, and hasn't fully resolved the contradiction. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a locked door they are deciding whether they have the right key for. "Is there a child in your vehicle without a car seat?" Sarah said. Not quite a question. "He's fine," Danny said. "He's almost 7. He needs a car seat until he's—" The boy moved. It was a small movement, deliberate, the movement of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. He reached beside him, into the gap between the seat and the door, and brought out a piece of paper that had been folded into quarters and unfolded so many times the creases had gone white. He held it out toward the window, not toward Danny, toward Sarah, with both hands, the way children hand things to adults when they need the adult to understand that the handing is the whole point. Sarah looked at the boy. The boy looked at her. He didn't say anything. He simply held the paper out, steady, and waited. She took it. It was a single page torn from a spiral notebook, covered in handwriting that sloped right and pressed hard, the writing of someone moving fast or in pain or both. Sarah had learned, in 3 years on patrol and 8 months in detective work, to read things fast and completely before deciding how to respond to them. And she read this one twice in under 20 seconds. And both times, she felt the same thing, the particular, vertiginous sensation of a traffic stop becoming something else entirely. The note was dated that evening. It began, "My name is Lucia Reyes. I am writing this before I go into surgery. If something happens to me tonight, please don't let my brother-in-law Danny take Marcus." Sarah looked up from the note. Danny Reyes was watching her with the expression of a man who has just realized something has gone wrong but hasn't yet decided what shape his response should take. "What does the note say?" he asked. He said it with the particular lightness of someone trying to make a question sound like casual curiosity rather than the thing it actually was. Sarah folded the paper. She looked at the boy, who was still watching her with the same careful attention, his hands now back in his lap, his posture unchanged. She looked at the license in her other hand. "I'm going to ask you to step out of the vehicle, Mr. Reyes," she said. Her name was in the note. That was the part she kept returning to in the 70 seconds it took Danny to comply, with the slow, calculating compliance of a man deciding how far cooperation served him. Her name, not her badge number, not her title, not a police officer or someone you can trust. Her name, Detective Sarah Chen, Ridgeline County. And below it, in the same pressing, urgent handwriting, "She helped us before. Marcus knows who she is. Show him this note if he can't find the words. He'll know what to do." The problem was that Sarah Chen had never, to her knowledge, met a boy named Marcus in her life. She had helped a lot of people in 3 years on patrol. That was the nature of the work. You showed up at moments that were often the worst of someone's day. You did what the moment required, and then you moved on to the next call. And the people behind you moved on too, in whatever direction the crisis had left them facing. She did not always know their names. She did not always know what became of them. What she knew about Lucia Reyes as of 2:19 on a Thursday morning was exactly what the note told her: a woman who had gone into surgery frightened enough to write instructions for her silent child, and specific enough in those instructions to put one particular name on the paper. She called it in from the service road, while Danny Reyes sat in the back of her patrol car with the window cracked and an expression she recognized as the expression of a man doing math. The dispatcher confirmed it in under 4 minutes. Lucia Reyes, 34, admitted to St. Agatha's Medical Center at 11:42 that evening with a ruptured appendix. Emergency surgery had begun at 1:15 a.m. Status: critical but stable. No other family contacts listed on the intake form. Under emergency contacts, a single name, Detective Sarah Chen, badge number that matched Sarah's exactly. Sarah stood on the service road in the cold quiet of a highway at night, with a sleeping city to her left and an empty stretch of dark to her right, and tried to remember a woman named Lucia Reyes. She remembered instead a Thursday in March, 8 months earlier, 2 weeks before she made detective. A domestic disturbance call to an address on the west side, a third-floor walk-up that had smelled of someone else's cooking, and the particular staleness of an apartment where the windows haven't been opened in too long. She had knocked. A woman had opened the door with the careful, assessing expression of someone deciding, in real time, whether the person on the other side of it was going to make things better or worse. Behind her, barely visible at the woman's hip, a small boy in Spider-Man pajamas. Sarah had not made an arrest that night. The call had been coded as resolved. No evidence of immediate danger, no injuries documented, subject departed. She had given the woman her card, and she had said, in the particular careful way she used when she suspected the visible situation and the real one were significantly different, "Call me if anything changes." She had not known, driving away, whether the card would be kept or discarded. She had not known whether calling if anything changes was something the woman would ever feel safe enough to do. She had not known, until this moment, that the woman had kept the card for 8 months and had, on the worst night of her year, made sure her son had it. Marcus was asleep in the back of the patrol car by the time Sarah finished the call, not deeply asleep, the watchful, shallow sleep of a child who has learned not to fully let go of consciousness in unfamiliar places, but asleep enough that his hands had unclenched in his lap. He had given up the note without argument. He had watched Danny Reyes get out of the Tesla and stand on the service road with the resigned compliance of a man accepting a situation he intended to renegotiate later, and something in the boy's posture had changed in that moment. Not relaxed, exactly, but settled. The specific release of a body that has been braced for something and has finally identified what it was. Sarah had one hand on the patrol car door when he reached out and touched her sleeve, a single light touch, no more. And when she looked at him, he simply looked back at her, and she understood, in the way you sometimes understand things that haven't been put into words, that the touch was a question, and the question was, "Are you going to leave?" "I'm going to be right here," she said. "Right outside this door." He withdrew his hand. He folded it back into his lap. He went to sleep. She stood on the service road in the sodium lamp glow for a long time, watching the deputy manage Danny Reyes's account of events, watching the patrol car window, where the shape of a small person in Spider-Man pajamas was visible in the back seat. Genuinely still now, not the watchful stillness of the car ride, but the looser stillness of a body that has finally set something down. She thought about a boy who had not spoken in 93 days, who had sat in that moving car for however long they'd been driving, who had known where the note was, who had waited, not for a random adult, for the right door. Some decisions take all of a person's available courage. Some of them are made without a word. It would be 3 hours before Sarah would learn what Danny Reyes had actually been doing with that boy on an empty highway at 2 in the morning. And when she did, the understanding would arrive not as a surprise. She had been building toward it since she read the note, but as the final piece of a shape she had already been tracing. Danny Reyes was the younger brother of Marcus's father, Hector, who had died of a sudden cardiac event 4 months earlier at the age of 38. Young, traumatic, and, as Sarah's investigation would eventually establish, not as financially uncomplicated as it appeared at first. Hector had carried a substantial life insurance policy, the kind purchased by a man with a child he intended to raise and a future he was building toward. The policy had a standard beneficiary structure: Lucia as primary, Marcus as secondary in the event of Lucia's incapacitation or death. What it also had was a less standard provision that Hector had apparently added without fully explaining to Lucia, a guardian clause, naming Danny Reyes as provisional legal guardian of Marcus in the event that both Hector and Lucia were unavailable, a provision that had seemed, when Hector signed it, like responsible contingency planning, and that looked, on a Thursday morning, with Lucia Reyes in critical care and Danny Reyes in the back of a patrol car, like something rather more deliberate. If Lucia died in surgery tonight, Marcus's legal guardian became Danny, and Marcus, as secondary beneficiary on a policy worth $800,000, became Danny's ward. Sarah had been a detective for 8 months. She had seen financial motives before. She had learned, through those 8 months, that the most dangerous version of a financial motive was one wrapped in the language of family concern. I was just trying to help. I was just trying to make sure he was safe. I was worried about him being alone. I had every right to take him. He's my nephew. Who else was going to be there? She had heard some version of all of those sentences from Danny Reyes, in different orders, across 90 minutes, in an interview room, at 4 a.m. And every sentence had been technically true. And every sentence had been, in the way that technically true sentences sometimes are, completely misleading about the actual shape of what had happened. What had actually happened was this. Danny Reyes had learned his sister-in-law was in emergency surgery at 11:42 p.m. He had arrived at the apartment where Lucia had left Marcus with a neighbor at 12:55 a.m. He had represented himself to the neighbor as Lucia's designated emergency contact. He had taken Marcus. He'd been driving at 94 miles per hour on an empty highway toward an address in a neighboring county that turned out to be a vacation property registered to a trust that included Danny as a beneficiary. A property whose distance from the city would have made it considerably more difficult for anyone looking for Marcus in the hours after Lucia's surgery to find him quickly. He had not, in any of this, technically broken a law that was immediately obvious. Sarah understood this, and she understood also that understanding it did not change what she was going to do next. She placed Marcus in emergency protective custody at 3:15 a.m., which was the administrative instrument available to her, and she called Priya Ose, her former patrol partner and now a CPS family liaison, at 3:17, and she said, "I need you to come in early." And Priya, who knew the tone Sarah used when she meant it, said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes," without asking any further questions. The social worker who arrived alongside Priya was a man named Gerald Park, who had been doing this work for 16 years and who asked Marcus, in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who has learned that rushing a frightened child accomplishes nothing, a series of yes or no questions that Marcus answered with nods and headshakes, and once, for a question about whether he was hungry, a small lift of his shoulders that Gerald interpreted, correctly, as a maybe. Marcus did not speak. He had not spoken, Sarah would learn from his school records later that morning, since the day of his father's funeral. His school had flagged it. His pediatrician had flagged it. The term they used was selective mutism, trauma-induced, not an inability to speak, but a silence, so entrenched by grief and fear, that speech had become, for now, the thing he could not offer to a world that had not yet given him enough reason to trust it with his voice. He had offered her the note, though. That was what Sarah kept thinking about, across the administrative machinery of the next several hours, the forms and the calls, and the careful procedural scaffolding that built up around an emergency custody situation, the way scaffolding always builds around something fragile. He had reached beside him in the dark back seat of a moving car, and he had held out both hands, and he had given her the only thing he had. Lucia Reyes came out of surgery at 5:48 a.m. She was conscious at 8:20, groggy and frightened, and asking, before she asked anything else, where Marcus was. The nurse told her he was safe. She asked the nurse to tell her exactly what safe meant, because safe meant different things, and she needed to know which one. Sarah was at the hospital by 9. She sat beside Lucia's bed with her badge in her lap, and her notebook open, and she asked the questions she needed to ask, and Lucia answered them, in the particular flat, factual voice of a person who has been telling a version of this story for months to people who did not know quite what to do with it, and who was hoping, this time, that it would land somewhere that could actually hold it. Danny had always disliked her. That was where it started. The simple, ordinary fact of a family member who had never fully accepted that his brother had chosen someone outside the family's expectations, who had translated that particular resentment, over the years of Hector's marriage, into a watchfulness that had felt, in the good years, like competitive attention, and that had shifted, after Hector's death, into something she recognized as something else entirely. He had contested the will. He had appeared at her door unannounced. He had told her, once, that Marcus would be better off with family who understood where he came from, which she had understood, correctly, as not meaning her. She had been afraid of him for 3 months. She had not been able to explain her fear in terms that felt concrete enough to take to anyone official. Because Danny had never threatened her directly, had never done anything she could photograph or record, had simply been present in the particular, consistent way of someone who wants you to understand that they are watching. She had kept Sarah's card. She had found it in the pocket of a jacket she hadn't worn since March, and had held it for a long time, and had put it in a drawer, and then, on the night she was taken to the ER, in an ambulance with her appendix in crisis, and the neighbor coming up the stairs to stay with Marcus, she had taken it out of the drawer, and she had written the note, and she had given the note to Marcus, and she had told him only one thing. I told him, Lucia said, that if anyone came who wasn't our neighbor Mrs. Ocon, he should show the note to whatever adult he could find. She paused. He's 6 years old. He hasn't spoken in 4 months. I didn't know if he could do it. I thought maybe he wouldn't be able to. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. He's stubborn, like his father. Once he decides something, it's decided. Sarah drove back from the hospital in the early morning light, through streets that had not yet filled with the day's full noise, and thought about a boy who had decided something. She thought also about what Lucia had told her in the hospital room during the 3 hours Sarah had sat beside her bed, not the legal details, which mattered and would be documented, but the smaller things around them, the texture of what a life looked like when someone was afraid in the specific, chronic, undocumentable way that Lucia had been afraid. The way Danny had started calling more often after Hector died. The way he had started appearing, not with enough frequency that she could point to a pattern with confidence, but with enough that she noticed. The way he had, on 3 separate occasions, offered to take Marcus for the day, offered in the way that suggestions are made when the person making them has already decided the answer, in a tone that made the offer feel less like generosity and more like the statement of an intention that hadn't yet fully arrived. She had said no each time. He had not pushed. She had interpreted his acceptance of no as reasonable. She now understood it as a man who had decided not to push because he had already identified a route that didn't require her cooperation. He had waited for an emergency. A ruptured appendix was not something a person could prevent or predict, but a man who had been watching a woman carefully for several months would know that if an emergency arrived and she was unconscious and her child needed collecting, a neighbor with no reason for suspicion would open the door to family without question. Lucia had said, at some point in the middle of the 3 hours, something Sarah would think about for a long time after. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, because nothing he did was ever quite enough to be a thing I could point at. It just accumulated. And I didn't know how to explain an accumulation to anyone who hadn't lived inside it. Sarah had written that down, not because she needed it for the case, though she did need it, but because it was the truest description she had heard in 8 months of detective work of how the most dangerous situations actually develop, not in single dramatic acts, in accumulation. He was staying with Priya for now, in the temporary arrangement that the system assembles around children in the hours before something more permanent can be established. Priya had texted at 7 a.m. He found the dog. I think they've reached an agreement. Sarah had looked at that text for a long time, and something in the center of her chest had done something she hadn't expected it to do, which was something close to relief. She had been divorced for 2 years. She lived in an apartment that had 2 bedrooms because she had moved in expecting her life to fill the space, and had learned, over those 2 years, that the space was simply space. Not inadequate, not excessive, simply empty in the particular way of rooms nobody was using. She had not been looking, in that empty apartment, for anything. She had been managing, which was a different activity with a different outcome, and she had become quite good at it. She was not thinking, driving back from the hospital in the morning light, about Marcus. She was thinking about the note, about the specific quality of decision required to write instructions for a silent child on the night of a crisis, to fold the paper into quarters and press it into the hands of a 6-year-old and say, "You know what to do," about a woman who had kept a card in a drawer for 8 months because she had understood, on a night when Sarah had knocked on a door and given the card and driven away, that help had been offered and might be needed later, and had stored that possibility with the care of someone who did not have a great many such possibilities to spare. She had helped more people than she remembered. That was the nature of the work. But Lucia Reyes had kept count. The investigation into Danny Reyes developed over the following 3 weeks with the particular pace of legal processes, slower than Sarah wanted and faster than she had feared. The guardian clause in Hector's policy, examined by an estate attorney Priya connected to, through a pro bono family law network, was not fraudulent on its face, but was found, upon deeper review, to have been drafted with a specific version of the future in mind that its language did not directly state. A forensic financial specialist identified in Danny's recent accounts a pattern of transactions consistent with someone anticipating an incoming sum on a specific timeline. The timeline matched, within a range of weeks, Lucia's surgery. Danny's attorney argued that his client had simply been concerned about his nephew's welfare in a family emergency. Danny's attorney was good at his job. The argument was not unreasonable, and Sarah knew it, and she spent long hours in the week after the surgery building the kind of case that did not depend on a single compelling piece of evidence, but on the accumulated weight of specific, documented facts. The arrival time at the apartment, the distance to the vacation property, the 3 unanswered texts from the apartment neighbor who had been expecting Danny to come by in the morning, not at midnight. None of it, individually, was a smoking gun. Together, it was a picture. And a picture, presented clearly to the right people, had a way of making its own argument. Sarah worked the case the way she worked everything that mattered, in the specific, patient way of someone who has learned that the difference between a case that holds and a case that collapses is usually not the size of the evidence, but the quality of the documentation. She called Gerald Park at CPS. She called the estate attorney Priya, connected her with a woman named Roberta Fenn, who had built her career specifically on the intersection of family law and financial abuse, and who reviewed Danny's account history with the same focused attention a surgeon brings to a set of films, pausing at specific entries to note things that would have looked, to a non-specialist, like ordinary transactions, and that looked, to Roberta, like the shape of a plan. She pulled the vacation property records. She verified Danny's arrival time at the apartment against the neighbor's account and against the building's entry log. She requested Hector's insurance policy in full, which took 11 days and 2 formal requests and 1 call from Roberta to the company's legal department. And when it arrived, she read the guardian clause 3 times and then called Roberta and said, "Is this what I think it is?" Roberta said, "It depends on when he knew it was there." Sarah spent 2 weeks finding out when he knew it was there. Marcus, during this period, started eating breakfast at the kitchen table while Sarah worked from the counter on her laptop, not because she had invited this arrangement, but because he had arrived at it on his own, appearing in the kitchen one morning with his library book and sitting down in the chair that had apparently become his chair, and that had remained his chair for every morning after, without further discussion. She had learned to make the coffee slightly weaker than she preferred, because the smell of strong coffee before 8 in the morning had produced, on the second morning, a small, eloquent wrinkling of his nose that she had interpreted as feedback and acted on. She did not work on the case in front of him. She had made that decision in the first week and held to it, not because she thought he didn't understand what was happening, she suspected he understood more than she would have guessed, but because the kitchen in the morning was supposed to be the space where the case didn't reach, the space where the worst possibilities weren't present, and she intended to keep it that way. On the 11th morning, without looking up from his library book, Marcus slid the book a few inches across the table so that the page he was on faced toward her. The page had a photograph of an anglerfish, the deep, bioluminescent kind, with a lamp dangling from its forehead and the enormous teeth. He tapped the page once with one finger, and then pulled the book back and went on reading. She had spent 30 seconds looking at the photograph before she understood that he was, in his particular way, making a point about things that looked one way on the surface and were something different underneath. She went back to the laptop and found the third set of transactions and identified the specific pattern Roberta had been looking for. Marcus spent 2 weeks with Priya before the preliminary custody ruling allowed him to move to temporary placement with Sarah, which was a development that the system produced through its usual unglamorous process of forms and home inspections and interviews, and one long afternoon in which a caseworker named Jerome walked through Sarah's apartment and asked her questions, whose answers she gave as honestly as she could, including the question about whether she had any experience with children who had experienced trauma, to which she said, "Not specifically, but I'm learning," which Jerome wrote down without visible judgment and later cited, in his report, as evidence of appropriate parental self-awareness. She put a bed in the second bedroom, she bought a box of cereal that a 6-year-old might find acceptable, and then bought 2 more kinds when she wasn't sure, which Priya found extremely amusing. She did not, consciously, think of herself as preparing for something permanent. She thought of herself as providing a stable temporary situation while the legal process moved toward its conclusion, which was the honest and careful way of thinking about it, and which left room for whatever came next. Marcus arrived on a Saturday with a backpack that contained 3 changes of clothes, 4 library books, and a Spider-Man figurine with a missing arm that he appeared to consider non-negotiable in terms of packing priority. He stood in the doorway of the second bedroom and looked at the bed, which Sarah had made with the care of someone who understood that an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room is a significant ask of a child who has not had a reliable floor to stand on in several months. He turned to look at her. He looked at the bed. He looked at her again. Then he walked to the bed and sat on it, deliberately, and bounced once, with the judicious expression of a child conducting an assessment, and then he took the Spider-Man figurine out of the backpack and placed it on the nightstand, arm side out, and that was that. Sarah stood in the doorway and felt something behind her ribs shift to a position it had not occupied in a long time. She did not push for speech. Priya had connected her with Marcus's child therapist, a woman named Dr. Nora Adeyemi, who had been working with him for 3 weeks, and who told Sarah, in a phone conversation the evening before he arrived, that the selective mutism was genuine, was trauma-rooted, and was not something that could be hurried or managed toward a resolution. It had its own timeline, and the best thing Sarah could do was make the environment consistent, make it low pressure, and let him understand, through the ordinary evidence of daily life rather than through explicit reassurance, that the floor beneath him was not going to move. The one thing that breaks selective mutism, Dr. Adeyemi said, isn't therapy, it's safety that has been proved rather than promised. You can't tell him it's safe here. He has to find out. Sarah took this seriously in the way she took most things that required action. By finding out what it looked like in practice and then doing it, she developed a routine that was predictable without being rigid. She cooked dinner at the same time every evening, badly, which Marcus observed from his position at the kitchen table with the focused attention of a small person conducting quality control. And she got better at it in increments that she suspected were related to the quality of his observational feedback, communicated entirely through expression. She drove him to school and picked him up, and on Fridays she stopped at the same bakery and let him point at whatever he wanted, which he did, with a precision that told her he had been studying the options all week. She did not pretend the silence wasn't there. She talked to him the way she would have talked to anyone she was sharing a space with, not performing normalcy at him, just actually talking about the day's events, about the cereal selection's ongoing inadequacy, about a raccoon that had gotten into the neighbor's trash on Tuesday and that she was fairly certain had a whole operational plan, because the way it moved, suggested prior reconnaissance. She did not always know if he was listening. She suspected he was always listening. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 11 weeks after the night on the highway. Sarah came alone. Lucia Reyes came with the estate attorney and a folder of documents and the composed, braced expression of a woman who had spent 11 weeks recovering from surgery and building a legal case simultaneously, and was prepared for either outcome while remaining unwilling to accept the worse one. Danny Reyes came with his attorney, who made the argument Sarah had expected, in the reasonable tone of a man who had decided that tone was his strongest tool. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Marguerite Obi, who had been on the family court bench for 9 years, and who had the particular quality of attention Sarah had learned to recognize in certain judges, the quality of someone who has read everything in the file and is now watching the room to see what the file missed. She asked several questions whose answers Sarah gave in the flat, specific language of documented evidence, and several questions whose answers Lucia gave in the flat, specific language of lived experience, and one question she asked Danny Reyes that his attorney objected to and the judge overruled. The question was simple. When did you learn your brother had added you to the guardian clause? Danny Reyes's answer was technically correct. He said he had learned it from the will after Hector's death, and it was the answer that completed the picture, because the will had been filed for probate 2 weeks after Hector's death, and the transactions in Danny's accounts that the forensic specialist had flagged had begun 3 weeks after Hector's death, which was 1 week after the will was filed, and the guardian clause became public record. The judge granted permanent custody of Marcus to Lucia Reyes, with an order of supervised contact for Danny that would be reviewed in 18 months. She included language in the ruling about the documentation of concerning conduct and the importance of the child's established relationships and therapeutic progress that Sarah's attorney later described as unusually detailed for a preliminary ruling, which Sarah understood meant the judge had also done math. It was not a dramatic ending. There was no moment of collapse, no public humiliation, no announcement. Danny Reyes walked out of the courthouse with his attorney, and Sarah did not watch him go because she was watching Lucia, who was sitting in a hallway chair with both hands pressed flat on her knees and her eyes closed, doing the particular thing people do when they allow themselves, for the first time in a long time, to actually exhale. After a moment, Lucia opened her eyes and looked at Sarah across the hallway. "He knew," she said quietly. "Not a question." "Probably for a while," Sarah said. "But he didn't." Lucia stopped, restarted. "He didn't do anything obvious enough that I could." "I know," Sarah said. "That's how it usually works." Lucia looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked back at Sarah. "Marcus wants to give you something," she said. "He told me." Sarah looked at her. "He told you?" Lucia's face did the thing it did when the subject of Marcus speaking came up. A careful, controlled, not quite crying, the expression of a mother who has been told not to make a scene of it when it happens, because the making of a scene is its own pressure, and who has apparently managed this with considerable difficulty. "This morning," she said, "he told me to give it back to you when it was over. He said it should go back to the person who started it." She opened her bag and took out a piece of paper, folded into quarters, the creases white. The note. Sarah took it. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of a piece of spiral notebook paper that turned out to weigh considerably more than its physical mass suggested. She thought about a woman writing this in a hospital intake room with one hand, the other in the fourth, pressing hard with a pen because the moment required it, trusting a silent child to do the rest. She thought about a boy who had held it out with both hands in the dark. "He can keep it," Sarah said. Lucia shook her head. "He said no. He said it did its job." Marcus was at Priya's for the afternoon. Sarah drove there directly from the courthouse, and when she knocked, he opened the door himself, which was a new thing. For the first 3 weeks, he had always waited for an adult to do the opening. On the principle, she now understood, that the state of a door was information worth receiving before committing to being visible through it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Priya's dog nosed around behind him, the loose, waggy disinterest of a dog who has already decided this person is acceptable and is simply maintaining the connection on his own terms. "It's done," Sarah said. "Your mom's fine. You're going home." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He had the same careful, cataloging expression he had used on the service road on that first night, the one that assessed whether a person was the safe kind or the other kind. She had learned, over 11 weeks, that he conducted this assessment with everyone, and that she was one of a small number of people who had, at some point in the preceding weeks, apparently passed it, because he no longer conducted it with her. He simply looked. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet and slightly hoarse from disuse, and entirely steady. "Thank you." 2 words, that was all. He did not appear to find them remarkable. He stepped back from the door, courteous in the manner of a host who has issued an invitation and expects it to be accepted, and went back inside to collect his backpack and the Spider-Man figurine with the missing arm, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway doing something undignified with her face, that Priya, appearing behind Marcus with the expression of a woman who was not going to acknowledge what she had just witnessed because she was a professional, pretended not to notice. The days that followed were ordinary in the way that days are ordinary when they no longer have to carry the weight of a crisis. Lucia and Marcus moved to an apartment on the east side, smaller than they might have wanted, but in a building with a good landlord and a window in Marcus's room that looked toward the park. Sarah saw them on alternate Sundays, which was an arrangement that had arrived without being formally discussed and had solidified into routine without anyone marking the moment it became one. Marcus spoke in sessions with Dr. Adeyemi, then with Lucia, then in the full ordinary cadences of a child who has decided that words are after all worth the risk of spending them, in the tentative, and then less tentative way, of someone learning a language they actually already know. He asked questions that were specific and patient, and sometimes, Sarah thought, years older than his face. He asked her once, on a Sunday, why she worked nights. "I used to not be able to sleep," she said. "Can you now?" She thought about it. "Better than before." He nodded, the nod of a person filing a data point. He ate half her toast. He went back to the book he was reading, which was about deep-sea fish, and which he had chosen specifically because, he had explained with some emphasis, most people didn't know what was actually down there. The note was on her refrigerator. She had put it there the day after the courthouse, held up by a magnet that had come with the apartment and that she had kept without particular intention. And it had been there through all 11 weeks, and it was there still, not because she needed reminding of what it said, but because it was the kind of thing that had earned its place on a wall, in the same way that certain objects earn their places not through monetary value or aesthetic quality, but through the simple, specific fact of what they carried and where they traveled and who held them along the way. Lucia had pressed hard with the pen. The letters were clear enough to read from across a kitchen. "My name is Lucia Reyes. I am writing this before I go into surgery." Some nights, Sarah stood at the counter with her coffee and read it, not because she had forgotten it, but because it still did something to her that she had no better vocabulary for than the thing she had felt on the service road at 2:19 a.m., when she had looked up from the paper at a boy who was watching her with both hands out, patient and decided, waiting for her to understand that the handing was the whole point. She had been a cop for almost 4 years. She had knocked on a door in March and given a woman a card and driven away, not knowing whether the card would be kept. She had not been looking that night for anything beyond the next call. The next call had been waiting, in a drawer, for 8 months. It had found her on an empty highway at 2 in the morning, folded into quarters, carried in the hands of a child who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. Some things are given without knowing what they are. Some people keep them anyway. And some nights, years later, you are still understanding the weight of what you handed over, and to whom, and what they did with it when they finally had the room. If there was ever a moment, a note, a card left in a drawer, a single sentence someone trusted you to carry, that changed the shape of things, leave it in the comments. Just that. We'll read every one.